Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of French Friday with David French. David, good to have you here. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me, Skye. And I'm just going to apologize to listeners. I don't normally sound like this. This is what slight flu, maybe COVID, or whatever whatever kind of malady afflicting me sounds like. So,
Well, we appreciate you being here anyway, and I'll try not to work you too hard, and you can give short answers if you need to. We got to start off though with the Trump verdict. We are recording this on Friday morning. On Thursday evening, we got the verdict. He's guilty on 34 counts of fraud. There's a lot out there. Everyone's analyzing this. You did a live stream last night for Advisory Opinions with Sarah Isgur. And I want to direct people there to get into kind of the legal analysis, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the political implications of this verdict. Does this change the calculus on the election in any way?
I think it does, actually, Skye. And I'll explain why. Now, obviously, you cannot go to Twitter or any form of social media and get any sense at all that this is changing anybody. It's Democrats are celebrating, Republicans are furious, the people in the middle are like, well, okay, I have worries about this case, but also he really did a lot of really nasty things, so how should I think about this? And so if you go on social media, where the people who are really engaged in American politics just congregate, it will look like everyone's just reinforcing their priors, and they are on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
But if you know what the dynamics of the race, so the dynamics of the race are very interesting. As of right now, Joe Biden has a very strong lead with the people who pay a lot of attention to politics. If you're reading newspapers, if you follow politics closely, Joe Biden has a big lead. If you don't pay much attention to politics, you are not a high likelihood voter, you're a low propensity voter, Donald Trump has a big lead with those folks. Now that creates a challenge for Biden. So if you're Biden and you're losing with low engagement voters, it becomes very hard to say, well, you just need to tweak your messaging in this way, or you need to change your campaign strategy in this way, because these people aren't paying attention. They won't notice a tweak in campaign strategy. None of that will register with them at all.
Right.
However, a headline that says Trump convicted can break through even to the lowest information voter. And so I think there's a chance here, and I think a likelihood that you will see some erosion of Trump. Look, if you're a person who's believing the dam will break against Donald Trump, that's like 2015 thinking or 2016 thinking. This will do it. This is the thing. No, we know nothing is the thing. But we do know that there are things that he does that erode his support, that chip away at his support. And look, we're at the end of a string. If you go back to last May of 2023, he was found liable for sex abuse. Then he was found liable for fraud. He was found liable for defaming a sex abuse victim. And now he's been convicted of felony counts related to paying hush money to cover up a purported affair with a porn star right after the birth of his youngest child. And so this is a remarkable string of jury verdicts, judicial determinations. And it's just still remarkable to me, Skye, that in this broader Christian world, the real outrage is that anyone tried to hold him to account. That's the real outrage, not that this guy, that juries and judges have found that this guy has done a lot of utterly reprehensible stuff.
Yeah, the irony of it is when you talk to conservative culture warriors, kind of the MAGA conservative culture warriors, they will argue pretty regularly that we need to protect our society against the corruption of Washington, and we need to protect our children against the sexualization and perverse nature of the LGBT movement, and the trans movement, and all these different things that are going on, all the sexual ugliness of our culture. And in order to do those things, we need to defend to death the corruption of Donald Trump and his affair with a porn star and the cover up of that with hush money. Like, it's just bizarre, the logic that's going on the right. But let me disagree with you.
Okay.
Because I'm unconvinced that this is going to do anything. And here's why. A couple weeks ago, I interviewed Tim Alberta. He was back on the show, and he was telling me, we were talking about how close this election is. And you know it, of the tens of millions of votes that are out there, 2020 was decided by a sliver, a few 100,000 votes in a handful of states. And that's really where the battle is. And he said that in his engagement with folks in the Trump campaign, they are not strategizing to try to win any of those swing voters. They don't believe the election will be won by persuading swing voters. They believe the election will be won or lost by energizing your base. And how angry can you make your base, and how motivated can you get them out to vote? So in 2020, the Democratic base was really angry, really upset. You had the George Floyd stuff going on. You had the mismanagement of the pandemic, and you had all of Trump's garbage that people were just fatigued by, and they were really motivated. And Trump's voters were somewhat less motivated in 2020, a little complacent. So when you look at that, this conviction fits into the narrative that Trump is a messianic character who's a martyr for the cause. And this is inflaming his base and more likely to motivate his base to really come out and vote in a way that I think the Democratic base is somewhat ambivalent about Biden. They're not excited about him. They're worried about his policy on Gaza. They don't like a number of things he's done. And so whose base is more energized at this moment? And polling from the New York Times is showing that in those critical swing states, Trump is still ahead of Biden. Yeah. And, despite all the indictments, despite the documents found at Mar-a-Lago, despite all of these cases, it's only helped him. So why would a conviction now do anything to change that narrative that he's a martyr against the system to inflame his own base? That's my concern in all of this.
No, I think that's incredibly valid. And look, you might be exactly right, but my contention is that his actual base isn't big enough to win him the election. The actual MAGA base that is susceptible to being really activated is not actually big enough. And we get a distorted vision of its size because it's so active and aggressive on social media. But the interesting thing about the polling is that right now Trump isn't winning because of his base. That's the interesting thing in the polling. He's winning because of these disengaged voters, including young Black and Hispanic voters who normally the Democrats would say, oh, they're absolutely coming home. Like they're going to eventually come home. But because of the divisions in the liberal coalition, left of center is far less united, say, than it was in 2020. It's more divided. There's a lot of angst that these folks won't come home. But it's a very weird situation, Skye, where you could actually map on, here is exactly who we're losing. And that group of people isn't actually a base. It's the folks who just barely turn on the news, who barely know anything that's going on. And I think a lot of that is related to vibes. In other words, I feel bad about the state of this country. I feel bad about inflation. I feel bad about things even beyond the actual merits. So for example, there was a poll that came out just, a few days ago that showed that a majority of people thought America was in a recession, when the reality is America's economy is actually best in the world at this moment. So amongst the leading developed countries. And so you have a lot of people who are in this low information category who are discontent. And I don't want to minimize inflation because especially if you're lower income, inflation has really mattered. Now, again, it's less than a lot of other or almost every other major developed country, but that doesn't matter to you because you're paying more for milk and bread. And the fact that they're paying more in Britain or Germany that's not like, yay, Biden for you. So you can't minimize inflation, but a lot of people are under this impression that the United States is in more distress than it is. And you see this in this incredible gap between what people say about their own lives versus what people say about the direction of the country. So the overwhelming majority of Americans express a lot of contentment for their own lives. And then they feel like the country's going to hell in a handbasket. And so this is that sort of low information voter kind of situation that isn't really the basis. it's this mass of people who have some nostalgia for 2016 to 2019, who look at the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, remember the inflation of a couple of years ago, and just have kind of given Trump a pass for COVID entirely, as if that didn't matter at all. And they kind of want to go back to 2016 to 2019. And so I think that that's really where Biden is most vulnerable. The MAGA base is the MAGA base, but it's just not big enough.
Yeah, I think my read on things, and this is hardly scientific or research, but my vibe is that most people desperately want acceptance from their peers and communities. And so when you live in an area that is dominated by blue voters or dominated by red voters, most people want to just be accepted by that group, and they will conform to what their community expects of them, to be Trump or to be Biden. The question then is not, will people conform to the expectations of their community? They will.
Yeah.
The question is, will they conform and be motivated enough to actually go to the polls on November 5th? That's the question. And that will be determined by which side is more angry, which side is more afraid, which side is more on fire for their side, which community is more enraged. And my concern is, over the last year or so, back in 2022, the Trump phenomenon looked like it was over because the midterm elections did not go well for MAGA candidates.
Yeah. No, it did not.
There was a lot of deflation on excitement for Trump. He just seemed like he was in the doldrums. Nothing was happening. And then you had all of these indictments come forward, and it just reinvigorated his base, reinvigorated his campaign. They broke their website yesterday with donations after the verdict came out.
Yep.
So my concern is not, yes, there are a lot of low information voters out there, and those low information voters are going to conform to their communities. The question is, will they conform to the point of being motivated to go to the polls on November 5th? And I think right now that momentum is probably with MAGA communities, not progressive Democratic communities. So, and frankly, Joe Biden is not a deeply inspiring figure. He's not Obama. He's not Bill Clinton. He's not one of these charismatic leaders that really motivates people to sacrifice their comfort to strive for him. And everything that's occurring just fits so perfectly the Trump narrative, both the martyr narrative that he's trying to play, but also the narrative that everything is corrupt. You can't trust anyone. So you might as well elect me because at least I will be corrupt for your interests. And that's a very compelling narrative for a lot of people who hate the system or feel like they've been abandoned by the system.
Yeah. No, it is. Absolutely.
You can respond to that, but then I want to ask you one other thing about the Trump verdict before we move on.
The bottom line is that Trump is the greatest turnout machine ever for the Republicans and the Democrats. Mm-hmm. And so if you go even back to 2020, Joe Biden has never had a lot of enthusiasm. He's never had a cult. He's never had a base of support like Trump has had. He's never had a base of support like Barack Obama had. He never has had that really core enthusiastic base. Right. He has had the benefit of Trump activates more people on the left than he activates on the right. He's had that advantage. Now, the problem that he's facing right now is that right now Trump is not activating the left as much as he's activating the right. And
exactly,
the left is divided. And especially since Gaza, it's been more divided than ever. And so, it's really interesting, Skye. I think we're finally beginning to see with much greater clarity that America isn't really red-blue. I think if you were going to have more than one party, you'd have to have four. You would have to have a far left party, a center left party, a center right party, and a far right party. Mm-hmm. Because the right and the left are pulling apart all on their own.
Yes.
And I think especially since the Gaza war, a lot of people have now seen the divisions on the left. The divisions on the left have broken wide open in a way that they were kind of concealed by the unanimity in facing Trump. But then once the Gaza war kicked off, the divisions on the left really exposed themselves. And we're used to the divisions on the right. You've had the Never Trump or the Trump reluctant faction, and then you've had MAGA, and that has been playing out. The Civil War is being fought on the right, county committee by county committee over, all over the United States. But we haven't seen that division on the left as much. And now it's wide open. And so Biden has this really difficult problem because on the one hand, one path to victory would be solidifying his hold over the white college-educated voters who crossed from Republican to Democrat in 2020. Those folks helped give him the election. Absolutely. But if he loses so many people on his left, then even those white college-educated voters who came over in 2020 won't be enough.
That's right.
And so he's got a real issue because of these divisions. And honestly, Skye, I don't know when these divisions are going to heal. I don't think that we're going to see the war in Gaza end before the election. I'm not quite sure how these divisions will heal. I do think that the far left is becoming so extreme in many ways that they might be self-marginalizing, but he's got a problem. He's got a problem. Unlike Trump, who's just like, I'm not trying to persuade anybody. It's me and mine versus you and yours. The Democrats are much more of a bigger coalition party. And so Biden's got to take care of all of that coalition. And he really hasn't been able to do it. And that's one of the reasons why he's in this very tough position.
Okay, before we leave this topic, I know you have talked in various places, including on Morning Joe, about Justice Alito and I don't know what they're calling it now, Flaggate.
Yeah, I don't know.
The fact that his wife apparently flew an upside down American flag at their home in Virginia, which is traditionally a sign of enormous distress, but was also used during the January 6th riots and the kind of Stop the Steal movement as a symbol of pro-Trump Stop the Steal symbology. And then he has flown a flag at his vacation home, the Appeal to Heaven flag with the tree, which is also a very old flag, but has become a core symbol of the MAGA movement. There are still cases pending before the Supreme Court about Trump seeking immunity, presidential immunity from prosecution in the January 6th case. Does the Alito flag controversy have any impact, you think, on the outcome of these cases? Or in a weird way, does it actually reinforce the Trump narrative that you can't trust the judicial system to be unbiased? Because just as there are biases like Sam Alito, there are biases in New York and Manhattan and Judge Merchan and all the things that Trump is saying about him. Therefore, it's just power. It's raw power. You can't believe it. Does that feed into his rhetoric and his narrative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A couple of strands here. One is, how big a deal is this? You know, the fact that the flag was flown upside down. And I have this position that it's a heck of a lot bigger deal than Alito's defenders are saying that it is, because not so much because we have definitive evidence that Alito consented to the flying of the flag. Like right now, the evidence is Alito says, I didn't want it. I didn't want it flown, but my wife refused to take it down. And then the conservatives are saying, look, he said he didn't want it and his wife refused to take it down. Case closed, matter closed. Wait, that's not the way you deal with any other public official. You don't view their own account of the story as the definitive account. And if you're an ordinary average American and you find out that a flag was flown upside down at the Alito household at the exact moment when the upside down flag meant insurrection in parts of the country, I saw it in where I live in a MAGA part of Tennessee. And so to then say, oh, but that's just his wife, it's not him, move along, nothing to see here. There are some small number of American families who would say, okay, I get it. Husband and wife can really go be at odds with each other. A lot of other families go, wait, what? You're going to allow a flag that is a radical flag to be flown outside your home when you're a public official, and you're not going to do anything more than say, well, I just asked my wife to take it down and she said no. That doesn't pass the smell test. And I think that that's a legitimate concern. You know, this is something that really bothers me. At the same time, Skye, the legal argument for recusal is really hard to make here because the facts are so foggy. and also because there is an actual duty to sit. So you have to overcome the duty to sit. And you might think, well, why is there a duty to sit? Why would that make any sense? Well, the answer is in the odd number of Supreme Court justices.
Correct.
So it is not cost-free to say, Samuel Alito, recuse yourself. That could mean that the court is literally unable to render decisions. And so, in other words, not function, because you can't go and lift up an appellate court justice like the chief judge of the Sixth Circuit or the 11th Circuit or whatever. You can't lift them up and say, here, fill in. That's not the way this works. And so when it comes to recusal, I'm not seeing the legal case for recusal strong enough to overcome the duty to sit. But when it comes to this is bad, this should not happen, I'm squarely in the camp of this is bad, this should not happen. And Skye, I think and Trump, of course, puts out this statement saying, you go, Alito, don't back down to these people.
Mm-hmm.
Look, the MAGA world views it all as power. That's exactly how the MAGA world views it. And so they rally to Alito if they feel like Alito's on their side. If Alito issues an opinion that is counter to them, then they're going to turn on him with a vengeance. Everything is outcomes. Everything is based on power. That's just the way it is. The same MAGA people who are like, this is a political prosecution of Donald Trump, can't believe this happened, are cheering the fact that Hunter Biden's about to go on trial. I mean, it's all, in their mind, it's all power. But my view of it is, I think the Supreme Court is, of the three branches of government, the best functioning of the three branches. But this is a terrible lapse in judgment to allow that flag to be flown.
Okay, a couple follow-ups here before we move on. Number one, would it change anything if instead of an upside-down American flag or an appeal to heaven flag, if they had just flat out flown a Stop the Steal flag or a Trump 2024 flag? Would that change anything here, or is that essentially the same?
If it was that blunt, because the Alito defense is essentially where Martha Ann, a Washington Post reporter, goes up and Martha Ann's very aggressive, saying it's a flag of distress and talking about this neighbor situation. Sure. So because there is some ambiguity here in the interpretation, was this about a neighborhood dispute versus a symbol for Trump? There's that little bit more, because it's just not clear. There's a little bit more leeway here. If it was that blatant, Trump 2024, Stop the Steal, whatever. And then Alito says, well, I asked her to take it down, but she said no. Again, that's a worse, the facts then get steadily and steadily worse. Whereas they're still at least plausible that all of this flag stuff was because she had a screaming match with a neighbor and she's a flag person. From the Times reporting, she's just got all kinds of flags. And so she's like...
but that doesn't explain the vacation house and the appeal to heaven flag.
Yeah, now the appeal to heaven flag is a little different deal because two things are happening at once here. The appeal to heaven flag is a flag of the founding. So it's like the Don't Tread on Me flag. And so you will see places, government buildings and other places, fly the appeal to heaven flag, fly the Don't Tread on Me flag. And they've done it forever. It's been part of American history. It is also true that the MAGA world has adopted a lot of these flags as a symbol of their own revolutionary movement. And they play sort of a double game, which is the flags are in-group signaling, so that if you're driving through a neighborhood here and you see the Don't Tread on Me flag or the appeal to heaven flag outside of a house, with about 99% certainty, you know that person is, a MAGA person. Mm-hmm. However, if you say, well, these are MAGA flags, they get indignant. No, these are the flags of the founding. So there's this double game that is played, but it is the case that there are people who have long flown the appeal to heaven flag without any connection to MAGA at all. So that one's in many ways more ambiguous.
What do you think the reaction would be if a liberal justice, let's say Sotomayor, who I think is kind of viewed as the most progressive justice on the court, if Sotomayor had flown, a rainbow flag or the LGBTQ flag outside her home during, what was it, 2014 with the Obergefell case, or during the case with the Colorado baker, these cases that involved LGBTQ issues, if she had flown that flag at the same time that she was responsible for making decisions involving LGBTQ legal issues, would that not be seen as in some way biased? Or if a liberal justice flies, I don't know if there's a Planned Parenthood flag, but if there's a Planned Parenthood flag and Planned Parenthood is before the Supreme Court in the Casey argument or whatever it is, isn't it weird to have somebody who is advocating before the Supreme Court for their case to have a flag for that person flying in the justice's yard? How is that not a violation of ethics, of impartiality on the part of the court?
Oh,
It'd be like if Lady Justice was blindfolded with a Stop the Steal blindfold. It's like, it's a little bizarre.
well, it is, to me, Skye, it is 100% crystal clear and obvious that if the facts were reversed here, all of the people who are saying, not all, 99% of the people are saying, it is outrageous that you condemn Samuel Alito for the action of his wife. This is outrageous. How dare you? Would be turning around and saying, see, told you that Sonia Sotomayor is biased, thoroughly biased. She's just an ideologue. All of this would flip around. And a lot of the people on the progressive left would say, how dare you impugn Justice Sotomayor's integrity? And so a part of this is you flip the facts, the partisan, all of it just flips. But there is something interesting in the Supreme Court's past, and that is some progressive justices have crossed the line in the past. So, for example, Ruth Bader Ginsburg would allow women's groups to use like a signed copy of one of her opinions as a fundraising tool. Mm-hmm. That's not proper. That should not happen. And so one of the things it's important to acknowledge is that there are instances in the past where some of the justices on the other side have engaged in behavior that it's not clearly unethical, but is it best practices? No, not best practices. And some of this goes back to, my colleagues in the editorial board at the Times wrote a tremendous editorial after some of the Clarence Thomas stuff came out with the private jets, noting that this has been a practice amongst a lot of the justices. Now, Thomas may have gone further than some of them, but hitching rides on private jets and things like that is something that justices have done. And so, if you come in and you look at the Supreme Court just in a series of snapshots based on the latest headlines, you often don't know much about sort of the history in full. And the history in full says, yeah, there have been times when some of the left-leaning justices have crossed what I think are lines of propriety, if not crossing actual ethical lines. They've crossed lines of propriety.
Yeah. I'm not trying to defend either side here. What concerns me is that at a moment in American history when so many of our institutions are being undermined and the trust in those institutions are being attacked constantly.
Totally.
And you're right. One of the few parts of our government that has shown some resiliency to those attacks is the judiciary. All the more reason why in this moment they need to hold themselves to a higher standard, because they are facing enormous challenges and there are very important cases before them. And the perception of impartiality is more important than ever. And they keep making unforced errors.
This is one of my points, Skye. There's no justification for that flag.
Right.
There's just no. And you can tell me all day, well, he said he asked Martha Ann to take it. Look, you as an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, you have a responsibility to the public. Right. And it is entirely fair for a member of the public to see that flag flying upside down. And it's not just Martha Ann's house. It's Samuel Alito's house. That's not just Martha Ann's flagpole. It's Samuel Alito's flagpole too. And it's entirely fair for a member of the public to say, ask what is going on. And then all these right-wingers saying, how dare you ask that, are not helping.
Yeah.
They're not helping because there's no justification for it.
It just seems like madness to me. Like if there were a case before the Supreme Court involving Facebook and social media regulation, and in the midst of hearing those arguments, one of the justices was flying a meta flag outside their house, you'd be like, we got a problem here. But it's just bonkers. All right. Let's move on to other stuff. So we recently, we have a Holy Post book club where every quarter we select a new book, and our Holy Post Plus subscribers get copies of those books. We discuss it. We have the author on. And the most recent quarter, we have done the book, and I interviewed the author recently. This one, it's called Ownership, The Evangelical Legacy of Slavery in Edwards, Wesley, and Whitefield. It's by Sean McGeever. And it's mostly history, but it's basically dealing with what do you do with these founding figures of American evangelicalism, Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, George Whitefield, who we credit with the First Great Awakening, we credit with the spread of Christianity throughout the colonies and then the early republic, with some of the greatest theological thinking that's been done in America through Edwards. And yet all of them were either blind to or very supportive of the enslavement of African Americans. Which brings up a broader question I wanted to talk to you about, is just how do we think about whether it's theologically founding figures or the political founding figures of this country who were nonetheless deeply flawed people in their ethics, in their morals, in their views of women, of minorities, of indigenous peoples, of enslaved African Americans. How do we navigate holding on to the good things that some of these figures gave to us while at the same time acknowledging their flaws? I'm just going to open it up to you, David, and hear what's your thinking on this. You live in the South. You were raised in the South. There's all that controversy about Confederate figures and monuments and stuff like that, which kind of gets into this as well. What advice do you have for others about how to think about the complexity of these historical figures?
Yeah, that's a great question, Skye. And I think the debate about historical figures has been colored and distorted by the fact that we have had a pattern of idolatry, might be too strong a word, hagiography. Sort of, we have spent generations in this country sort of pumping up the founding fathers as sort of uniquely wonderful men, right? Uniquely fantastic, uniquely insightful, uniquely wise, uniquely virtuous. And so a lot of American history, because it's tied to this dramatic revolution, this beautifully written declaration, especially the top part of the declaration, a constitution and a setting up of Madisonian democracy with a Bill of Rights that was one of the great statements of human rights, especially one written at that time. And sort of this effort to, build up American patriotism that, we spent generation after generation after generation just really puffing these people up. And that also is true, I think, for church fathers as well. You spend generation after generation puffing them up. And then this really interesting thing happens when people encounter their lives in full. And the interesting thing that happens is a lot of times, especially younger people, when they encounter the lives in full of the founding fathers, they feel a bit betrayed. They feel confused. And this is actually part of the reason I think why, quote unquote, college, this big fear that people have about my kid goes to college and then they turn woke or whatever. Well, sometimes what's happening when they go to college is they're actually getting another part of the story that they didn't get before. And if they've never gotten that part of the story before, it can be deeply disorienting. Wait, James Madison owned slaves, this whole Madisonian democracy. He was a raging hypocrite with the way he envisioned limited government and individual liberties, and then he's owning slaves. Wait, what's going on? Wait, these early church fathers, they owned slaves, they defended slavery. What is going on? And so I think there's just this whiplash that people have. And I think the cure to the whiplash lies going all the way back in how we initially teach about the American founding, how we teach about the American church. And it has to be full. You have to teach it in full. Did George Wesley do terrible things if he was rationalizing slavery? Yes. Did he have some theological insights? Yes. How should we view him? Well, we should view him as a deeply flawed person who had some interesting theological insights and made some contributions to America that are valuable, even as he was terrible in other ways or did terrible things in other ways. And I feel like we've got to get to this point where we can hold these two thoughts together And what ends up happening is because we have this tradition, especially in the South, especially in the Southern Evangelical Church, of almost like, again, it's not founder idolatry. It's not quite that strong, but it's in the neighborhood. It's got whiffs of it. And then also founder rationalization. So it's not just founder sort of idolatry or hagiography. A subset of that is founder rationalization. And that goes something like, they were just men of their times. How could they know? But if you dive into the historical record, they knew. There were arguments raging about slavery. And there's even really powerful and poignant stuff that some of these slave owner founders wrote. It's just heartbreaking, where it's essentially, yeah, I know this is wrong. But I can't stop because it's all my family's wealth, or it's everything, it's the foundation of my prosperity. Yeah. And so,
economic interest overrides morality.
Yeah. And so I feel like we have this giant problem because we've created this founder, this idealization of the founders that really can't survive and counter with the historical record in full. And then what you do with the historical record in full is often so colored by the sense of disappointment or frustration when you realize, wait, I've been kind of sold a bill of goods about these people.
I agree with you. I feel like there is this human tendency, and maybe it's more prevalent in our culture than others, I don't know, but there's this human tendency to just want to view everyone as either wearing a white hat or a black hat.
Right.
And so, especially those with whom I identify. So as an American, I want to identify with Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all these figures because they're my founding fathers, quote unquote. So they have to wear a white hat because by inference, I then wear a white hat.
Right.
And if I'm an American evangelical and the founders of that movement, in the 18th century were George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, everything. Well, they have to wear a white hat because then I get to wear a white hat. And you see, like, even, that horrible statement that Wayne LaPierre said after the shooting at Sandy Hook, where he said, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And not to open up the gun debate with you again, but again, there's that sense of, if you're wearing a white hat, yeah, you should have a gun because you will always perpetually be righteous and good in everything you do. And if you wear a black hat, you should never have a gun because you're going to be evil in everything you do. The Israeli-Palestinian debate, I've just come back from Israel. We need to talk about that at some point. But, there's this mindset of, okay, who's wearing the white hat here and who's got the black hat so I can make a clear differentiation of who to side with and who. And we take all nuance and complication out of our understanding. And it leads us to defend the indefensible or to celebrate people who incorporate things in their lives which we ought not, especially as followers of Christ, be celebrating because they're contrary to him and his nature and his kingdom. But that simplicity, that demand to put everyone into one of those two buckets just makes us dumb. And I think it's rooted because we want to believe that we fit squarely in one of those buckets. And therefore, those with whom we identify must also fit in that bucket.
I think that's spot on, Skye. But the reality is, and I'm reminded by the quote from Solzhenitsyn, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote that the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And so this idea that, okay, well, James Madison can do good things and also did evil things, that's the most human thing in the world. And the fact that he did a good thing does not negate what he did was evil with regard to owning human beings, but it also doesn't negate the fact that there's an enormous amount of wisdom in Federalist 10. The Bill of Rights is a marvelous document for outlining human rights. And so I guess, my response to all of this is, look, what we're dealing with is the hangover from all these generations of Americans, extremely patriotic Americans, spinning out a narrative that is best country, best people, right? And so if the narrative is best country, best people, and look, I love my country. I love the United States of America. I've served it in uniform. But this sort of, anytime you're putting this best country, best people gloss on history, you're going to start to really run afoul of reality. And so, one of the questions I like to ask people is, how old were you when you learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And
Yeah.
for a lot of people, my generation, it's the what now?
Yeah, they still don't know.
They still
about
don't know. Many other people
Right.
would say, 45, I was 50, maybe. And I think that what's happening is a lot of our history wars right now are between sort of three broad factions. Faction one being that says, how dare you denigrate the legacy of these founders? That how dare you? This is the greatest country with the greatest people. Then there's faction two that's like, look at the reality of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and all of this. It was all a lie. It was all a lie. This founding was a lie. All of the respect you have for the founders was a lie. Look at, these traditional these Christian figures who excused slavery or owned slaves. Everything they said was worthless. And then there's a third bucket, which I think is actually what the polling shows where most people are, which is just give it to me straight, guys. Just give it to me straight. What did James Madison think and believe? What did James Madison do? I'm an adult. I can handle it. And I think that's where most people are, but that most people that are in that situation are not activists. The activists tend to be in bucket one or bucket two, which is it was all a lie or this was all the greatest thing. And the reality is we need more voices in bucket three, which was some of these guys did terrible things and also had marvelous insights. What do you do with that? Well, you realize that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart.
Right.
And
I think one way to think about this is it's a maturing question. When we are young children, we tend to view our mother and father as infallible, benevolent, righteous people. They can do no wrong. And then we get to adolescence and the pendulum can swing far the other way where our parents are idiots and they can do no right and they're flawed and wrong and ridiculous. And then at some point, hopefully in early adulthood, we reach a place of loving our mother and father, or to use biblical language, to honor our mother and father as actual human beings,
right?
Where we recognize the goodness that they possess and the blessing they have been to us and the things they have afforded us. And we see their shortcomings and flaws, their sins even at times. And we reach a place of honoring and respecting them as full human beings, good, bad, and ugly. And that's just a maturing process. But it feels like an awful lot of Americans are stuck either in that early childhood phase toward America, which America can do no wrong, or they're stuck in that adolescent phase of America can do no right.
Right. Yep.
And the founders, or same thing with a lot of the fallout that's happening with evangelicalism right now. People raised in the American evangelical subculture who are either defending it tooth and nail, saying that it's righteous in everything, or they are condemning it in every way because of its failures or hypocrisies. And I'm not hearing a ton of voices that are coming to a place of, you know what? Here's what's really actually beneficial and good about the American evangelical church. And here are its shortcomings and failures. And I am a product in some way of all of it. And I want to honor what's good. I want to acknowledge what's bad. And I'm not going to have here's the final piece of the kind of psychobabble I'm putting out right now, is at some point in your own adulthood, you have to come to a place of self-differentiation from your mother and father, where you recognize I am my own person. And so I don't have to have a family that all wears white hats, nor is my family all wearing black hats, because I'm wearing my own hat and I am not bound by where I have come from. So my defense of those things or my condemnation of those things doesn't have to be a zero-sum endeavor.
I think that's exactly right. I love that analogy. The teenager, they can do no wrong, then they can do no right. And then you sort of see them as the full human beings that they are, which, by the way, is, a very healthy way to, this is the way people grow up. And like the extremes are not healthy, but they're a reality. And this is how you mature. And I'm with you. It's interesting when the 1619 Project came up and then Trump did the 1776 Project. That was just a microcosm of this.
Yes.
The 1619 Project folks were like, this is America's true founding. And the 1776 people are saying, pay no attention to them. The great words of the Declaration, that's who we truly are. And I wrote a piece back in the, 2020 or 2019 where I was like, no, it's both. It's both. You know,
Right.
when the first slaves arrived in 1619, that was a very tangible statement that this new American civilization that was being born on the eastern seaboard of the United States was going to be a lot like the old civilizations that came before it. Brutal, exploitive, oppressive. And then when you had documents like the Mayflower Compact, then ultimately the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, you had an aspiration that was at odds with the reality. And I think the way to think about the founding of America, it is not that it created a just country. It created a concrete set of aspirations that were in tension with the injustice that was prevalent.
Yes.
And a lot of American history really is the battle between 1619, the spirit of 1619, versus the spirit of 1776. And sometimes the spirit of 1619 prevails. And thankfully, often the spirit of 1776 prevails. But we have fits and starts and we regress. And, you know, to go from the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War Amendments to Jim Crow shows how we can regress.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's part of the brilliance of Lincoln and his rhetoric, whether it's the Gettysburg Address or his second inaugural address, which are both engraved in the Lincoln Memorial. When you read those addresses, on one hand, he's acknowledging the failures of America. He's acknowledging the deep injustice of slavery and our shortcomings as a people. And at the same time, calling us to those higher ideals. He embodies that contradiction of 1619 and 1776 together. And I agree entirely. We are a combination of those things. And maybe in a future French Friday, we can talk about how then does this relate to not just historical figures, but contemporary ones.
Right.
Of, you know, the failure of leaders whom we admire today or who have deeply influenced us, and then we discover their shortcomings. Before we wrap up, we have a few minutes left. We're going to do something completely different now, to kind of quote Monty Python. I want to talk about a television show that we both watched recently that I think we both really, really loved because there's a lot to mine from it. And that's the new version of Shogun, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's on Hulu, I believe.
Yep.
And it back in the 1980s, it kind of created the genre of the miniseries.
Yeah.
When it's based on a novel by James Clavell, and it's loosely based on historically informed events from what year was it? 1600 or 1700? It was, I think, 1700.
1600.
Anyway.
1600.
1600.
Yes,
1600. It's a story of a stranded English sailor who finds himself in Japan, in feudal Japan, and gets embroiled in the battles between the different warlords in Japan. So David, without like going through the whole plot and all the nuances of this drama, what stood out to you as not just why the series itself was so compelling, but what about the story really?
So many
you?
things. So many things, Skye. First, I'll just say the basics. It's beautifully shot. It's marvelously acted. The story is incredibly compelling.
It should get every award.
Award.
Give it to them, all of them. It's
Throw
amazing.
all of the awards there. It's the most compelling television I've watched in a long time, and I've watched a lot of compelling television. So, but here's some things that made it even more compelling. One was watching the Catholic-Protestant divide of the 1600s and how bitter it was. So the English sailor is obviously a Protestant. He's sailing to Japan, really trying to disrupt Portuguese dominance in trade with Japan. So this is part of the Catholic-Protestant divide, English-Portugal rivalries, and the absolute utter bitter contempt that you see between the Catholics and the Protestants is something that is alien to us now. Even a generation ago or 2 generations ago, it'd feel very familiar. But to see that, where, at one point, and I'm not going to have any major spoilers, but at one point, the English sailor throws down a crucifix and steps on it because that's idolatry. The crucifix was deemed to be idolatry. And so you see that. And then the other one was, and it's set in 1600, and I know the Enlightenment really didn't kick off until later than, in the mid 1600s, but there's this fascinating running culture clash between the English pilot and not just, and all of the Japanese, but principally Marika Sama, the the central female protagonist. And the philosophical clash is the Englishman has this view of individual liberty, that you have an ability to set your own course in life. You are the captain of your own soul. You are the master of your own fate, that you can choose not to be a part of all of this. And that she actually very powerfully states the counter case, which is, I feel sorry for you. You're kind of out on an island. You're, this individualistic path doesn't have the meaning that my path does, of being layered, fabric upon fabric, layering me into this community, even to the point where my own life is less important to me than the state of the community that I've belonged to. And it's such an interesting clash, and their discourse throughout the show along those lines is just fascinating.
Yeah, I agree entirely with all that. There's two things that stood out to me kind of on a more theological level, that beyond just the Protestant Catholic tensions that are imported from Europe to Japan in this story. I don't want to give away spoilers either, but sort of what interests me is the climax of the story is not a gigantic battle scene like you would expect between the clash of armies, right? That's not the climax of the series. Instead, the climax, I gotta be careful not to spoil it, but you're dealing with a highly collectivist culture and a very honor-shame based culture, and an incredibly patriarchal culture.
Yes.
And in the midst of all of that, you have this female protagonist, this one woman who enters into the system, and she submits entirely to the system. And in her submission to the system, she reveals its evil and its wickedness and its depravity, and ends up undermining the whole system. Yeah. And it's a very Christ-like cruciform exposure.
It really
of
is.
Evil.
Yes.
Right? Just the way Jesus submits himself to this horrendously evil system in Jerusalem and with the Romans and everything, and his surrender to it reveals its depravity and its evil, and ultimately breaks it. And I thought that was an incredibly powerful it's a gospel message in a completely unchristian environment, and it was amazing.
Yeah.
And the other thing that stood out to me is Toranaga, who is ultimately the Shogun.
Toranaga-sama. Yes.
Oh, just amazing actor, amazing character.
Phenomenal.
But slight spoiler here, but one thing he's a master manipulator, and he understands what's going on. He's playing three-dimensional chess all the time. And one thing that becomes clear by the end of the series is he's aware of and uses the evil intent of his enemies against them, and allows them to pursue their evil intention, all the while manipulating it to achieve the good that he wants done. Yeah. And it, again, very, very much like the redemptive power of God. You hear in Genesis when Joseph says to his brothers, that which you intended for evil, God intended for good. And just as the evil of the cross, the enemies of God, both spiritual and material, the enemies of God are all aligned against him to destroy the Messiah on the cross. God uses that evil for ultimate good, for the redemption of all things. So you see that in Toranaga, who allows evil, rather than stopping it in the moment when he discovers it, he allows it to continue to do its thing, but he steers it in a way which is ultimately going to bring out a greater good. And it's just an amazing story. It's brilliantly told, and there are layers and layers and layers of brilliance. And even if you look for it, Christian theology here that is illustrated in it.
When Marika, the central female character, she is Catholic Christian. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting seeing her wrestle with her loyalty to Christ and her loyalty to her Lord, which her loyalty to her Lord in that culture had to be absolute to the point of death. And it was really fascinating to see. And Skye, hadn't thought of it until you put it all out there like that, but that's absolutely fascinating. And I think, I hadn't thought of it like that, but I think that's a tremendous insight. And it actually did, even for her enemies, the way in which she exposed the evil shamed them.
Right.
Yeah.
which again, in an honor shame culture can work.
Yeah.
Not to bring it all back to the Trump scenario in his case in New York, but like, I think that's kind of Trump and the MAGA superpower is they're impervious to shame.
Yes. Yes.
So how do you can't how do you bring a system to a whether it's Gandhi or MLK or civil disobedience or all these, like, they're all based on awakening people's sense of shame.
Yeah.
And showing exposing the evil of what they're doing and making them feel ashamed for it. But where there is no shame, it doesn't work. And oh gosh, that's opening up a whole nother direction.
Part of the MAGA world has this ethos, which is never apologize.
Right.
Never. Even to the point when people are plainly, clearly wrong. I received through the grapevine an interesting comment that somebody who has specifically lied in public about our family has been asked to recant. And this person says, I can't apologize. I can't apologize. Wait, what? You can't? What that means is I can't and remain in good standing with my community.
Right.
That's what it means. That's what it means.
You would, I don't know who that person is, obviously, but in a Christian community where we value the way of Jesus, to not apologize, to not repent, to not admit wrong would be the thing that would put you in bad standing. But things have gotten so backwards that we've taken, we call good evil and evil good. That's what's happening here.
Yeah.
I felt conflicted watching Shogun a number of times because on one level you go, wow, the level of honor, there's a collectivism, there's a loyalty to clan or to lord or something that you're like, that is foreign to our experience in this culture.
Right.
And it's in some ways it's very admirable. The flip side of it is there's so much honor shame that people take their own lives and you're just like, no, that's not, you want to, my Western individualism comes forward and goes, this is horrible and evil and wrong. On another level, the show is fascinating because it's simply a fish out of water story.
Yeah, totally.
And you see the dilemma of cultural difference. I recently read the novel The Sparrow, and Caitlin Chess was on to talk about that book. And if you haven't read it, it's about the discovery of alien life and a Jesuit mission, a missionary mission to this foreign planet. And it's kind of a metaphor for colonialism and some of the things that go wrong when you don't really understand culture. And there's a scene in Shogun where the English sailor, the pilot, he's preparing, was it a pheasant, I think, that they had given him, and he wanted to prepare it in an English fashion. He's letting it hang outside his home and basically rot. And the other Japanese are like, this is disgusting. We can't do this. And they keep removing it. And he says, anyone who touches that pheasant is going to die. Just don't do it. And he meant it hyperbolically. They took him literally. And finally, somebody had to remove the pheasant because it was so putrid and disgusting. And they executed the guy for it. And the Englishman comes back and says, why did you kill him?
Yeah.
And they said, because you said anyone who touches this has to die. And they took him literally. And you're just like, oh my gosh, when you don't understand cultural differences, you can make tragic mistakes.
Yes.
And there's so much of that, I think, going on, even in our diverse culture, where we don't understand the signaling and the language and the way that one culture isn't really receiving what the other's trying to say. And it was a stark reminder for wisdom and cultural sensitivity, even within the United States.
Yeah.
Because we are such a diverse place and we often miss those cues.
No, I think that's absolutely right. That scene involving the execution was very powerful. And at the end of it, Blackthorn, the character, says quietly, I killed him.
Yes.
And you could see it was crushing. It was a crushing weight. But I thought that clash between the individual and collective throughout was just absolutely fascinating. And the thing that I liked about it is it didn't caricature either side. Mm-hmm. When the collective was making the argument to the individualist, it was the best version of that argument. When the individualist was coming back with, but wait a minute, you don't need to comply with an unjust call. It was powerfully presented. I thought it was, as I said, it was just tremendous television.
Yeah. So really encourage everyone to go out and watch Shogun and maybe interact with us online about your thoughts on it. Curious to hear what other people think about the way they've managed to think about flawed heroes, historical and theological. And then, of course, the Trump trials and the verdicts. Will it make a difference or not? Do you think David's right that it's going to move some people on the margins? Am I right that it's only going to embolden the MAGA base? Or maybe we're both right. We'll just see where that plays out in different states. Will it make any difference in the outcome in November? David, thank you for giving us your time. I know you're under the weather. We hope you're feeling well. And very encouraged. I saw Nancy's post about her latest testing. Looks like her treatments have been effective thus far. And we're going to continue to pray for her and you guys.
Yes, the treatments have been more effective than we were led to believe they could be. So we're thrilled. Surgery is next. I've told people this is the world's most miserable triathlon. You go through chemo, then surgery, then radiation. But hopefully the worst of it is behind us, hopefully. But yeah, the doctors are thrilled. And when the doctors are thrilled, we're thrilled.
Right. Well, we'll keep praying for you guys and celebrate when you celebrate, grieve when you grieve. And hopefully we can all see in some time that God was at work in all of this. So thanks again for being with us.
French Friday is a production of Holy Post Media, featuring David French and me, Skye Jethani. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This show is made possible by Holy Post patrons. To find out how you can become a Holy Post patron and to find more common good Christian content, go to holypost.com.